So I'm Dr. Jonathan Lundgren. I direct the Ecdysis Foundation and Blue Dasher Farm. So I'm an agroecologist, but I'm also a farmer and a beekeeper, and an entomologist is what was trained in. So the planet is facing some serious problems right now. We've got climate change and pollution and human health problems and biodiversity loss. A lot of this is now correlated with how we're producing our food. Not that we are producing our food, but how we're producing our food. And science is now correlating these planetary scale problems more and more with the simplification of our food production systems. And yeah, I think that this is one of the biggest opportunities that we have is working for solving some of these planetary scale problems, is working with farmers as the stewards of this land. So as we've gone down this simplified system, somewhere along the road it was decided that to be a good farmer you needed to farm bigger and simpler, right? Farm fewer crops on more acres. And the only way to really maintain that system is with agrochemical inputs. So things like fertilizers and insecticides and herbicides and fungicides. And it's gotten to this point where it's really our reliance on these chemistries is an addiction. And the question is who wins in an addiction scenario? And usually it's not the addict, it's the folks pushing the drugs. And right now there's a lot of money being made off of farming, but a lot of that money is not being made by the farmers themselves. And so what our goal with regenerative agriculture is to put that money back in the farmer's pocket while improving the natural resource base. So as we talk about the simplification of our food system, as we grow larger monocultures, it becomes very intimidating, right? As we discuss all of those planetary scale problems, that big list of problems, it's like, geez, how do we overcome something like this? And what's been really exciting to me is meeting farmers all over the planet that are already doing it. That they're already amending their own operations in ways that are going to solve these problems. And they're doing it profitably. It's called regenerative agriculture. It's an empowering term. What are we talking about? Sustainable agriculture. God, we've just degraded our natural resource base so much that simply sustaining that degraded resource base isn't good enough anymore. Not for the next generation. We actually have to be rebuilding our natural resources, soil and biodiversity, in the same place that we're producing food. So regenerative agriculture, there's central tenets of this are they're improving soil health. They're growing biodiversity on their farm while producing nutrient-dense food profitably. And by refocusing their operations away from just pounds of beef per acre and bushels per acre, they're focusing on soil health and biodiversity. What they're finding is that the yields and the profits of their operation just follow right in tow. And so it's really a fundamental shift in how we think as far as what our priorities are in our food production system. What does a regenerative farm look like? What a great question, and the answer is it looks like all kinds of things. Regenerative agriculture is not unified by practices, it's unified by principles, okay? So the principles that seem to be universally present in these regenerative systems are they stop tilling. They stop tilling the soil. That's step one. Or understanding just how damaging that tillage process is to life and soil health. They have to replace that biodiversity that they've just destroyed through the tillage process. Number two is they never leave bare soil. Bare soil is often dead soil, and we have to be harnessing the energy from the sun and putting it down into the soil. And the only way that you can capture that energy is with plants. It also holds the soil down, prevents erosion, it increases water infiltration and water balance in the soil, improves soil organic matter. There's a lot of great reasons to have living roots in the ground. The third principle that regenerative farmers employ is that some plant diversity is better than none, and more plant diversity is better than less. And the reason for this is that the diversity in a system, biodiversity is things like microbes and fungi and animals and plants and us. That biodiversity, almost every other group of organisms, the diversity of that group of organisms scales almost directly with how many plants are in a system. And so these regenerative folks are not eliminating food production from their farm. What they're doing is they're taking opportunities to increase plant diversity on their farms using agronomically feasible tools. So they're using things like cover crops. They're using things like interseeding and intercropping, where they're growing more than one crop on a single piece of ground. They're managing their field margins. They're varying crop rotations over years rather than just a corn, snow, corn rotation, which we have too often up in South Dakota. And then the final principle that unifies a lot of these regenerative farmers is that this diversity idea does not just count for plants. Integrating livestock and cropping systems is essential to making these profitable systems. And how you manage those livestock is also really important, because it's not just getting cows out there, okay? It's about integrating herds, so multiple species of livestock in the same place at the same time, as well as managing those livestock appropriately, where you mob graze them and then you move them frequently depending on what that particular piece of ground can support. Adaptive multi-paddock grazing systems. So when you end up including all of these tools together, all of these different principles together on your farm, and then using practices that are locally adapted to your region or your operation, then suddenly you have an extremely profitable operation that's resilient to all kinds of changes. We've designed such a system on Blue Dasher Farm, which is the demonstration farm that we operate in South Dakota. And yeah, last year we lost one of our crops, right? We lost one of our cash crops during harvest. Borage was what we were growing for seed. And it was a situation where it's like, you know, it grew well, and then harvesting that son of a gun was a real pain in the neck, and so all the seed shattered. We'll have a great crop for next year. I made more money off of that failed crop than my neighbors did off of their corn and soybeans. And the reason is because I first, before we even harvested the crop, I took a honey crop off of that piece of ground. And then I also grazed it. And so the question becomes, you know, how often can you lose a crop and still make money being a farmer? And the answer is every single time when you're regenerative farming. Every single time. Because you're stacking enterprises in, you have a resilient operation at that point. So it's an empowering thing. It's a tool that can be used for so many different approaches, including, you know, solving things like climate change, reducing agrochemical pollution, increasing the nutrient density and quality of your food that you're producing for your community and your own family, as well as rebuilding these rural communities, because we're starting to keep kids back on the farms. We're starting to see more of that money stay locally rather than get shipped off to the coop and carried away on a rail car. So it's an exciting time, and the farmers are leading it. So our research at Ecdysis Foundation, which is our 501c3 science and education group, we're doing scientific research to try to help remove barriers from farmers that are really innovating, right? The corn, soybeans, cows, guys, if they've got a problem, they know where to go, right? They've got the infrastructure there to help them. But the folks that are really on the front edge, that are really trying to innovate our food systems along an using ecological principles, they have nowhere to go for science, for information, for community. And so we're trying to become that as much as we can and remove those hurdles so that we can keep those innovative farmers pushing the gauntlet, right? Pushing it forward. And so our research focuses a lot on risk assessment of especially pesticides, and then also developing these sustainable systems, these regenerative farming systems, and measuring what these really successful regenerative farmers are doing on their operations. We just completed a study in the Northern Plains region where we looked at corn production systems. This was work done by my graduate student, Claire LeCan. And what she did is she found a bunch of farmers that were regenerative farming, that were kind of leading this charge in our research region. And we went out, we took a whole team out to these different farms, and we said, point us to the corn phase of your rotation. And they did, and we went out and we sampled the hell out of it, right? We looked at all of the bugs on the plants, in the soil, on the soil, whole bioinventory of each of these different fields. And then we also looked at their soil quality, and we looked at the profitability and the yields that they were producing on these cornfields. And then we said, point us, because these were the leaders, these were best management practices within the regenerative community, and then we asked them, point us to a neighbor who's doing things well with a conventional mindset. And they did, and we got permission, and we sampled the hell out of those fields too. This was done in North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Minnesota. And what happened was that these systems, there was a range of different practices employed in each of these systems, but they were unified in a couple of things. The regenerative farms all used cover crops, and none of them used insecticides, sometimes for years, decades even. All of the conventional farms used genetically modified crops, corn plants that were often treated, almost exclusively treated by neonicotinoid seed treatments. So the outcomes of this were staggering. The insecticide-treated cornfields had 10 times more pests than the cornfields that hadn't seen insecticides in decades. That's not supposed to happen, right? This flies in the face of everything that we're trained in entomology school about how to manage pests. You wait until the pests come up, and then you react to that problem. You slap it back down, usually with a pesticide. What this said is that these farmers, by changing the way that they were producing their their corn, they didn't have to worry about pests anymore. So they didn't need the input costs associated with genetically modified corn plants, as well as the neonic seed treatments. Next, the regenerative farms had a little bit lower yield, but they were twice as profitable as their conventional neighbors. You know what the profitability of the cornfields was related to? It was uncorrelated with yield. It was the profitability of each of these fields was correlated with how much soil organic matter there was, particulate organic matter in the soil. What this says is that these regenerative systems are not just good for the environment. They're not being produced simply idealistically, right? These guys are going this route because it's a good business decision. It makes a hell of a lot of sense. So somewhere along this line, we were sold this idea that farming bigger and simpler was the right way to farm. But what these farmers are doing is they're showing us that there's a better way. A lot of our research is focused on helping pollinators and bees. Honeybees are a big focus for us. And so we're trying to reform this area of the country where most of the nation's bees spend the summers, where they produce honey. And we could do that, but then right around October and then into December, the nation's bees are all packaged up and they're trucked over to the Central Valley of California. Beekeepers can no longer survive just on producing honey. They have to have pollination or funds in order to keep their businesses afloat. For political reasons, it gets to be very complicated. Anyways, anything that I'm doing in the Midwest to help the bees is completely negated when these bees travel across the country and are put into the deserts that current almond production systems are. Last year, I went down to the Central Valley of California to see what these bees were experiencing. And these almond orchardists, they're paying, you know, hundreds of dollars per hive, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars to have bees that will pollinate their crop. And I was visiting one of my beekeeper friends, and I'm looking up I'm like, there's a helicopter, and the beekeepers, yeah, yep, they're about to roast my bees. And sure enough, they sprayed fungicides right there, middle of the day, completely roasting. And we watched these bees just like crawl, like just death crawl back into their hives because these almond orchards just sprayed them out. Most of the nation's bees are killed in California almonds. So it became very clear that we really needed to make this change, and the almond board says soil health can't work on almonds. There's too many concerns about foodborne pathogens that would contaminate the almonds. It just doesn't work for our system. And that's what we were told about corn production as well in the Midwest. And so we decided to, Tommy Fenster is currently a graduate student who's working on this project. He's based in California. And his job is to find regenerative almond production systems, and we're going to compare those regenerative almond production systems with conventional neighbors. Looking at the system as a whole, the biodiversity in those systems, foodborne illnesses in the soil, soil quality, and then yields and profits of those systems. And I think that what we're going to find is that soil health does indeed work if people are brave enough and bold enough in order to make a change in their operation for the right reasons. It's a good business decision. It's the first time being on one of these almond orchards, these regenerative orchards, it's the first time that I've ever been in Central California agriculture and saw black soil. This man had created soil in the middle of this, what's now become a desert. And his neighbor continues to produce almonds. It's not even soil, it's gray. It's gray and it's dust. The almonds are being produced on chemotherapy. So it gave me a lot of hope. After being so depressed when I left California last year, when I left this year with my son, driving back across the country, I left with a real sense of hope and a vision for the future. So, exciting times.